In the quiet town of Maplewood, a young waitress named Claire Dawson carried a wound no one could see. 2 years ago, her entire family had been wiped out in a brutal act of revenge by a man named Victor Hale. Claire was the only survivor. She lived each day with silent grief, hiding her pain behind a tired smile as she served coffee and wiped tables. But fate had a strange way of testing her heart. One rainy evening, while returning from the market for her employer, Claire witnessed a car accident. The victims, 2 little girls, the daughters of the very man who had destroyed her life. The scene was chaos. The car had swerved off the road, and the children, Emily and Sophie Hale, were crying, their tiny bodies trembling. Claire froze. Memories of her murdered parents and siblings came rushing back. These children carried the blood of her enemy. Her hands shook as she stood there, torn between vengeance and compassion. And yet, something deep within her, stronger than hatred, moved her. Claire lifted both girls in her arms, rushing them to the hospital. She spent hours by their side, making sure they survived. No one knew her connection to them. To the world, she was just a kind waitress helping 2 helpless children. But inside Claire's heart, a storm raged. Why had she saved them? Weren't they the daughters of the man who had ruined her life? For nights, she couldn't sleep, asking herself whether she had betrayed her own family's memory. Meanwhile, the Hale family searched desperately for the mysterious woman who had rescued the girls. Victor Hale, once ruthless and feared, was shaken to his core. His daughters had been saved by a stranger, and he couldn't rest until he found her. 2 years had slipped by, quiet and unremarkable, like pages turning in a book no one bothered to read. For Claire Dawson, each day was much the same as the last. Early mornings at the diner, tired evenings in her rented room, and the silence of nights where memories pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. She had grown used to obscurity, almost invisible in a world that moved quickly around her. Yet that morning was different. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that prickles the skin and makes the heart uneasy. Claire stepped out of her modest little house, her apron tied loosely at her waist, ready to walk the familiar path to work. She reached for the latch of her gate and then froze. Parked at the curb was a sight so foreign to her world it felt almost unreal. A gleaming black Rolls-Royce, polished to a mirror shine, sat like a sentinel at her door. The morning sun bounced off its surface, sending shards of light into her eyes. For a moment she thought she was imagining it. People like her, people who scraped through life, paycheck to paycheck, didn't belong in the orbit of such luxury. Her hands trembled against the iron gate as the door of the car opened with a soft, deliberate click. Out stepped a man in an immaculate suit, his shoes reflecting the pavement beneath him. His presence carried weight, not of arrogance but of gravity, as though he bore something larger than himself. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The man's face was unmistakable, even though years had passed. The sharp jawline, the eyes dark as storm clouds, the air of someone who once commanded fear. This was Victor Hale. The name alone was enough to send a chill through her bones. The man responsible for her greatest sorrow, the man whose very existence was tied to her pain, was now standing a few steps from her front door. But he looked different. Gone was the coldness she remembered. His eyes, once like steel, now carried something softer, something heavy with humility. He did not tower with pride. He stood with the weight of gratitude pressing down his shoulders. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. All Claire could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her ears. Victor took a slow step forward, his hands shaking ever so slightly. His voice, when it came, was unsteady, stripped of its former power. "You saved my daughters," he said, his words breaking the air like a fragile thread. His gaze faltered, as though the memory alone humbled him. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling before he found the courage to go on. "You saved the only reason I live. And now I owe you everything." Claire's knees weakened, and she gripped the gate to steady herself. The weight of his words pressed against the fragile walls she had built around her heart. Her breath trembled, her chest rising and falling too quickly. She wanted to speak, but no words came. The image of those two little girls, so small, so frightened, flashed in her mind. She had carried them with trembling arms, her heart torn between hatred and mercy. And now, here was their father, the very man she had once cursed in her darkest nights, standing in humility before her. Victor reached into his pocket, but not with the arrogance of a man giving charity. Instead, it was the careful, respectful gesture of someone offering his very soul. He held out a small envelope and a set of keys that glinted in the morning sun. But his voice carried more than the items in his hand. It carried remorse. It carried gratitude. It carried the echo of 2 years that had changed everything. Claire's throat tightened, her eyes stinging with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. Her world, built on quiet suffering and silent endurance, suddenly cracked open to something unexpected: recognition, peace, and a strange sense of release. For so long, she had wondered if her act of mercy had meant anything, if it had been swallowed by the endless tide of life. But now, as she stood facing the man who once embodied her pain, she realized the truth. Compassion leaves an imprint deeper than vengeance ever could. The Rolls-Royce gleamed silently at the edge of her gate, but it was no longer the car that captured her gaze. It was the broken man before her, humbled by mercy, and the unspoken truth that forgiveness, even when it was born from the hardest soil, could bloom into something life-changing. Claire said nothing, but in her silence was the echo of strength, and in Victor's trembling words was the acknowledgement that her kindness had rewritten the story of their lives forever. Tears welled in Claire's eyes, burning hot against the cool morning air. Her body trembled, caught between the weight of memories and the reality standing before her. Every part of her wanted to hate him. She wanted to let years of buried grief rise up in a scream that would tear the silence apart. She wanted to throw his words back at him, to remind him of the family she had lost, the nights she had cried alone, the emptiness that never left her side. But she did none of that. Instead, she stood still, her fingers clutching the iron gate as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her breathing slowed, heavy and uneven, while her eyes locked onto his. In that fragile moment, Claire realized something profound. By saving his children, she had broken the very cycle of hatred that had chained her heart for so long. She had done the unthinkable, not for him, not even for herself, but for 2 innocent girls who deserved to live free of their father's sins. Victor's hand shook as he reached forward, holding out a set of polished keys and a white envelope. He did not thrust them into her hand with arrogance. Instead, he offered them with the humility of a man who had been brought to his knees by grace. Claire hesitated, her palm hovering, her body torn between resistance and surrender. Slowly, with a breath that quivered in her chest, she accepted what he gave her. Her thumb brushed over the cold metal of the keys, the weight pressing into her palm like a promise she did not ask for. She lowered her gaze to the envelope, its edges crisp, her name written across it in firm strokes. With unsteady fingers she tore it open. A folded sheet of paper slid out, the ink clear and undeniable. Her breath caught as she read, the deed to a home, not just a house, but a mansion far from the shadows of her painful past. Claire's knees nearly gave way beneath her. She gripped the paper tightly, as if it might vanish, as if this too could be stolen from her. Yet as the reality sank in, she understood that this gift was not about luxury or wealth. It was an offering, a bridge across years of suffering, and a quiet acknowledgement that what she had given could never truly be repaid. Victor's voice wavered, low and filled with sincerity. "This is only a fraction of what I owe you," he said. His eyes glistened, not with power but with remorse, and for a fleeting second, Claire saw not the man who had destroyed her family, but a father who had nearly lost his children. She folded the deed carefully, her fingers trembling as she slid it back into the envelope. Her chest rose and fell with a deep, uneven sigh. She looked at Victor, and though her lips did not form words, her silence spoke louder than any speech could. She was not forgiving him. She was not forgetting the past. But in choosing to save, she had chosen to rise above it. And that choice had freed her more than vengeance ever could. The Rolls-Royce gleamed quietly behind him, its polished surface reflecting the morning light. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers already forming. In a small town like Maplewood, nothing remained hidden for long. And soon, stories began to ripple through its narrow streets, stories of the waitress who had once lived in sorrow, who had chosen mercy over revenge. People spoke her name with awe, not because of the mansion she now owned, but because of the courage she had shown when life had given her every reason to harden her heart. They whispered of the woman who had stood unshaken before the man she could have hated, and instead chose to protect the innocent. And in that quiet recognition, in that shift of hearts, Claire found something more lasting than property or wealth. She found peace, the one gift she had thought would never belong to her again.